Preface to Famous Men of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Famous Men of Rome by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Preface. The study of history, like the study of a landscape, should begin with the most conspicuous features. Not until these have been fixed in memory will the lesser features fall into their appropriate places and assume their right proportions. In order to attract and hold the child's attention, each conspicuous feature of history presented to him should have an individual for its center. The child identifies himself with the personage presented. It is not Romulus or Hercules or Caesar or Alexander that the child has in mind when he reads, but himself, acting under the prescribed conditions. Prominent educators, appreciating these truths, have long recognized the value of biography as a preparation for the study of history, and have given it an important place in their scheme of studies. The former practice in many elementary schools of beginning the detailed study of American history without any previous knowledge of general history limited the pupil's range of vision, restricted his sympathies, and left him without material for comparisons. Moreover, it denied to him a knowledge of his inheritance from the Greek philosopher, the Roman lawgiver, the Teutonic lover of freedom. Hence the recommendation so strongly urged in the Report of the Committee of 10, and emphasized also in the Report of the Committee of 15, that the study of Greek, Roman, and modern European history in the form of biography should precede the study of detailed American history in our elementary schools. The Committee of 10 recommends an 8 years' course in history, beginning with the 5th year in school and continuing to the end of the high school course. The first 2 years of this course are given wholly to the study of biography and mythology. The Committee of 15 recommends that history be taught in all the grades of the elementary school and emphasizes the value of biography and of general history. The series of historical stories to which this volume belongs was prepared in conformity with the foregoing recommendations and with the best practice of leading schools. Teachers often find it impracticable to give the study of mythology and biography a place of its own in an already overcrowded curriculum. In such cases they prefer to correlate history with reading, and for this purpose the volumes of this series supply most desirable textbooks. It has been the aim of the authors to make an interesting story of each man's life and to tell these stories in such a style, so simple that pupils in the lower grades will read them with pleasure, and so dignified that they may be used with profit as textbooks for reading. The value of the illustrations can scarcely be overestimated. They will be found to surpass in number and excellence anything heretofore offered in a school book. For the most part they are reproductions of world-famous pictures, and for that reason the artists' names are generally affixed. End of preface. Of Famous Men of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Famous Men of Rome by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Chapter 1. Romulus. Part 1. Many, many years ago in the pleasant land of Italy there was a little city called Alba. It stood on the sunny side of a mountain, near the river Tiber, and not far from the Mediterranean Sea. In this city and around the mountain lived a brave, intelligent people known as Latins. Several other tribes inhabited the adjacent mountains and plains. The Latins were ruled by kings, and one of their kings in very early times was named Aeneas. He was a famous Trojan chief who had come over the seas to Italy and settled there with his family and friends after Troy was destroyed by the Greeks. A great many years after the death of Aeneas, one of his descendants named Procas was king of Alba. He ruled wisely and well for a long time, and his rather small kingdom on the mountain-side, with its wheat fields and vineyards, was very prosperous. He had 2 sons, one named Numitor and the other Amulius. As Numitor was the elder, he was heir to his father's throne. But when King Procas died, Amulius seized the kingdom by force and made himself king. Then Numitor, with his 2 children, a boy and a girl, left the king's palace at Alba and went to reside on a farm a short distance away. Part II. Amulius was now king, but he did not feel quite happy. He was much troubled about Numitor's son and daughter. The son, he thought, might some day claim the right to be king as heir of his father, or the daughter might marry and have a son who could become king, as grandchild of Numitor. To prevent either of these things from happening, Amulius had Numitor's son secretly put to death, and he appointed the daughter Silvia to be a priestess, or an attendant in the temple of the goddess Vesta. Only young girls were appointed attendants in this temple, and they had to take a vow that they would not marry for 30 years. They were called Vestal Virgins. It was their duty to keep a fire burning continually on the altar of the goddess. This was called the Sacred Fire, and it was believed that if it went out, some great disaster would happen to the city. Amulius now thought there was nothing to hinder him from being king of Alba all his life. But one day the god of Mars came down to the city from his palace on a high mountain top and saw Silvia as she went out to the temple to get water at a well. He fell deeply in love with her. She also fell in love with the god, for he had the appearance of a handsome young man. They were married secretly, and in course of time Silvia had beautiful twin boys. When Amulius heard of this, he gave orders that Silvia should be put to death for breaking her vow, and that the 2 infants should be thrown into the Tiber. These wicked orders were carried out, for no one dared to disobey the king. Fortunately, however, the babes had been placed in a stout basket, which floated along the Tiber until it was carried by the waters to the foot of a hill called Palatine Hill. Here the huge roots of a wild fig tree upset the basket, and the little ones were thrown out upon the river bank. At this moment a great she-wolf came strolling down the hill to drink at the river's edge. She heard the feeble cries of the infants, and went to the place where they lay helpless on the wet sands. She touched them gently with her rough paws, turned them over and licked their faces and plump bodies. Perhaps she thought they were some of her own cubs. At any rate, she carried the babes up the hill to her cave under a large rock. There she fed them as she fed her own cubs, and seemed pleased to have them near her. It is said that a woodpecker flew in and out of the cave many times a day, bringing berries for the boys to eat. One morning, as Faustulus, the herdsman of King Amulius, was going over Palatine Hill, looking for cattle that had gone astray, he saw the boys playing with the wolf at the mouth of her cave. He frightened the wolf away and took the boys to his home. His wife pitied the little foundlings, and cared for them as though they were her own children. The herdsman named them Romulus and Remus. They grew up to be strong, handsome youths, brave and kind. Until they were 20 years old, they lived with the herdsman and helped him in his work, and roamed over the hills light-hearted and free. During all those years Numitor lived on his farm, and his brother Amulius remained king of Alba. Numitor did not know that his 2 grandsons had been saved from a watery grave, and were living so near to him. But one day Remus had a quarrel with one of the herdsmen of Numitor, and they took him prisoner. They then brought him before Numitor, who was much impressed with the noble appearance of the youth, and asked him who he was. Remus told all he knew about himself and Romulus, how they had been found at the cave of the she-wolf, and had been reared by the king's herdsman. Just then Faustulus and Romulus came searching for Remus, and were full of joy when they found that no harm had come to him. Numitor questioned the herdsman about the finding of the twins, and after hearing his story was convinced that Romulus and Remus were Silvia's boys, who had been strangely saved from the wrath of their cruel uncle. He was very happy at finding his grandsons, and he thanked the herdsman for his good care of them. Romulus and Remus were also very happy at finding a grandfather and at the sudden change of their fortune. When they were told about Amulius and his wicked deeds, they resolved to punish him for the murder of their mother. So with a few followers they rushed to the palace at Alba and entered the king's chamber. "Behold, we are Silvia's sons whom you thought you had killed," they shouted to Amulius, as he started up in alarm at their appearance. "You killed our mother, and you shall die for it." Before he could utter a word, they sprang on him with drawn swords and cut his head off. Then they brought Numa to the palace, and the people welcomed him as the rightful king of Alba. III. After a little time, the two brothers thought they would build a city on Palatine Hill, where the she-wolf had nursed them. So they went to the hill and selected a site. Then they began to talk of a name for their city. "I will be king and give the new city my name," said Romulus. "No," cried Remus, "I will be the king and name the city after myself. I have just as much right as you have." So the brothers argued for a while, but at last they agreed to settle the matter in this way. At midnight Romulus was to stand on Palatine Hill, and Remus was to stand on another hill a short distance off. Then they were to ask the gods to show them a sign of favor in the sky, and the first who should see anything very remarkable was to name the new city and be its king. So they went to watch, but nothing appeared until sunrise of the second day, when Remus saw 6 great vultures flying across the sky, from north to south. He ran swiftly to Palatine Hill and told Romulus of what he had seen. But just then 12 vultures, one after another, flew high over the head of Romulus in an almost unbroken line, and were soon lost to view. Then Romulus claimed that he had the favor of the gods, as more birds had appeared to him, but Remus claimed that the gods favored him, as the birds had appeared to him first. Romulus asked the opinion of some of his friends, and as they all agreed that he was right in his claim, he paid no further attention to Remus, but began to lay out the new city. He gave it the name of Roma, or Rome, after himself. With a plough he marked out the space on Palatine Hill and along the banks of the Tiber, and he built a low wall round about to protect the city from invaders. One day while the work was going on, Remus came by in a very bitter mood. He was still angry with Romulus. He laughed scornfully at the little wall and said to his brother, "Shall such a defense as this keep your city? It may prevent children from getting in, but not men, for they can jump over it." So saying, Remus put his hands on the wall and sprang over it, to show that his words were true. Romulus, in a sudden outburst of rage, struck him on the head with a spade and instantly killed him, at the same time crying out, "So perish any one who shall hereafter attempt to leap over my wall." Then Romulus continued his work. While he was building his wall he also built some houses. The first houses were nothing more than wood huts covered with mud and straw. But in course of time the Romans had houses of stone, and they built fine temples and theatres and streets and squares, and at last Rome became the greatest and grandest city in the whole world. IV. Romulus founded Rome in the year 753 B.C. After he had built his city, he had some difficulty in getting people to live in it. He had only a few followers and was not able to obtain any more. He decided, therefore, to make Rome a place of refuge, to which people who had got into trouble in other countries might come for safety. And so when those who had committed crime in other places and had to flee to escape punishment found out that Romulus would give them a refuge, they came in large numbers to his city. People also came who had been driven from home by enemies, or had run away for one reason or another. It was not long, therefore, until Rome was full of men. There were men from many different tribes and countries. Thus the Roman nation began, and for years it steadily grew and prospered. But the Romans were much troubled about one thing. A great many of them had no wives, and they could not get any because the women of the neighboring tribes would not marry them, for the Romans had a bad name. Romulus was very anxious that his people should have good wives, but how they should get them greatly puzzled him for a long time. At last he hit upon a plan and began at once to carry it out. He sent messengers to the cities all around to announce that on a certain day a great festival in honor of the god Jupiter would be held on the plain in front of Rome. There were to be games, combats, horse racing, and other sports. The people were invited to attend the festival and also to take part in the contest for prizes. When the festival day came, a multitude of men and women from far and near assembled before the walls of Rome. Hundreds of pretty girls were there in fine dresses. A great many came from the Sabine tribe. This was a tribe of warriors that lived on a mountain near Rome. Suddenly Romulus blew a loud blast upon a horn. Then, quick as a flash, the Romans seized the girls and bore them off to Rome. The Sabines were greatly enraged at this, and their king, Titus Tatius, raised a large army and at once began a war against the Romans. The war went on for 3 years, but the Sabines were so strong that Romulus could not defeat them in the field. He therefore withdrew his army into the city. King Tatius quickly marched after him, resolved to take Rome or perish in the attempt. Now Romulus had erected a strong fortress on a hill near the Palatine, to keep invaders from Rome. The hill was called the Saturnian Hill, and the fortress was in charge of a brave Roman captain who had a daughter named Tarpeia. When the Sabines reached this fortress they could go no further. They marched up and down seeking for a spot where they might force an entrance, but they could find none. There was a small barred gate in the fortress, and through this gate Tarpeia came out to get water. King Tatius saw her. He at once stepped forward and said, "Fair maiden, open the gate and let us in. If you do, you shall have for your reward anything you ask." Tarpeia was gazing with admiration at the bracelets of gold which the Sabines wore on their arms. "I will open the gate," she said, "if you will give me some of those things which your soldiers wear upon their arms." King Tatius agreed, and Tarpeia opened the gate. As the Sabines rode past the silly maiden, each threw at her, not his bracelet, but his shield. The shield then used was round or oblong and made of bronze, or of wicker work or oxhide covered with metal plates. It had 2 handles at the back, and the soldier held it with his left hand and arm so that he could move it up or down to save his head or breast from blows. Tarpeia stood in amazement as the heavy shields began to pile up around her. One struck her, and then another and another. At last she fell to the ground and was soon crushed to death. When the soldiers saw that Tarpeia was dead, they took up the shields they had thrown at her. Then they hurled her body from the top of a great rock that was near the gate she had opened. The rock was afterwards known as the Tarpeian Rock, and for hundreds of years the punishment for traitors in Rome was to be thrown from this rock. As soon as they passed the fortress, the Sabines ran down the Saturnian Hill to make an attack on Rome. But Romulus and his band of warriors bravely came out of the city to drive back the enemy. The 2 forces met in the valley, and then a fierce battle began. But while they were fighting, a crowd of excited women came running from the city. They were the Sabine women whom the Romans had carried off. Some of them had their infants in their arms, and they rushed between the lines of soldiers and begged that the fight should stop. "Do not fight any more for us," they said to their fathers and brothers. "We love the Romans we have married. They have been good to us, and we do not wish to leave them." Of course this settled the matter. Romulus had a talk with King Tatius, and they agreed not to fight any more. They also agreed that the 2 nations should be as one. They joined their governments and their armies, and each of the kings had equal power. Soon afterwards King Tatius died. Then Romulus ruled alone for nearly 40 years. He was a wise and just king, and did a great deal of good for his people. He established a body called the Senate to help him in important affairs of government. It was called the Senate from senex, the Latin word for an old man. It was formed of the chiefs or old men of the earliest settlers in Rome. The descendants of those settlers were called patricians, or fathers, from the Latin word pater, a father. They were the nobles or upper class in Rome. The ordinary citizens were called plebeians, from plebs, the Latin word for the common people. Romulus took care to train up the young Romans to be good soldiers. Outside the city, along the bank of the Tiber, there was a great plain which in later times was called Campus Martius, or Field of Mars. Here the Roman soldiers were drilled. They were taught how to use the spear and the javelin, and the sword and the shield. They were also exercised in running and jumping, and wrestling and swimming, and carrying heavy loads. Thus the young men were made fit to bear the hardships of war, and to fight and win battles for their country. It is related that in his old age Romulus suddenly disappeared from the earth. He called his people together on a great field one day, and while he was speaking to them a violent storm came on. The rain fell in torrents, and the lightning and thunder were so terrible that the people fled to their homes. When the storm was over, the people went back to the field, but Romulus was nowhere to be found. Then it was said that his father, the god of Mars, had taken him up to the clouds in a golden chariot. Next morning at early dawn a Roman citizen named Julius saw a figure descending from the heavens. It had the appearance of Romulus, and it approached Julius and said, "Go and tell my people that it is the will of the gods that Rome shall be the greatest city of the world. Let them be brave and warlike, and no human power shall be able to conquer them." Afterwards the Romans worshipped Romulus as a god. They worshipped him under the name Quirinus, which was one of the names of the god Mars, and they built a temple to him on a hill, which was called the Quirinal Hill. End of chapter 1.
Famous Men of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jason Mayoff. Famous Men of Rome by John H. Haaren and A.B. Poland. Chapter 2. Numa Pompilius. 1. For a year after the disappearance of Romulus, there was no king of Rome. The city was ruled by the Senate, but the people were not satisfied. They preferred to be ruled by one man, and though they had the right to elect a king themselves, they left the choice to the Senate. The Senate chose Numa Pompilius, a very good and wise man who belonged to the nation of the Sabines. The first thing that Numa did, after learning that he had been chosen king, was to consult the augurs, to find out if it was the will of the gods that he should be the ruler of Rome. The augurs were what we should call fortune-tellers. A number of them lived in Rome. They were much respected and occupied a large temple at the expense of the public. They pretended that by watching the sky and observing how birds and animals acted, they could tell what would happen to people and to nations. Then, when they were alone, they would have a great deal of fun over the tricks they played upon the foolish people. Numa made many important changes at the very beginning of his rule. Before he came to the throne, Roman young men were brought up to no business but war. It was considered disgraceful for a Roman citizen, whether rich or poor, to work at any trade or manufacture. The slaves, who were persons taken prisoners in wars, did all the hard work. They made all the clothing, tools, arms, and household articles. They cooked and served the meals, and were general servants for the Roman families. Roman citizens might, however, without being degraded, work on farms and vineyards, and many of them made their living in this way. Shortly after King Numa began his reign, he divided some of the public lands into small farms, and gave one of these farms to every poor Roman. The public lands were lands that belonged to the nation, and not to private persons. It was rather hard at first for the new-made farmers to be contented on their farms and to do good work. They were mostly soldiers and had very little knowledge of anything except marching and fighting. But it was not long before they began to understand what a blessing it is to be self-supporting and independent. Their little farms were pleasant homes. They began to love their new life and soon were able to raise enough for the support of themselves and their families, with something to spare. 2. King Numa made many good laws. These laws were engraved on tablets of brass, and at certain times were read and explained to the people by lawyers. Numa was very friendly with the people of the countries surrounding Rome. He gave them help in times of trouble, and would never listen to any talk of war with them. During the many years that he was king, Rome had no enemies and no wars. In a sacred grove just outside the walls of Rome, there lived in a handsome grotto or cavern a beautiful woman named Egeria. Some persons called her a goddess, while others thought she was a fairy. She seemed to have a great knowledge of magic and could do wonderful things. Whenever she called to the songbirds, they would come flying around her. They would also perch on her head and shoulders and hands and sing the sweetest songs. Even the fierce animals of the woods were her friends, and great bears and wolves would lie at her feet for hours and purr like cats. This mysterious woman goddess, or fairy, or whatever she was, greatly loved and honored good King Numa, and at last they were married. Then she taught him many of the magical secrets she possessed. He carefully studied the lessons she gave him, and in time he was able to do wonderful things himself. 3. The Romans were earnest worshippers of the gods and goddesses. They believed that there were many such beings, and they had many grand temples for religious service. King Numa always paid great attention to religion. He appointed a large number of officials to take care of the temples and to see that all the sacred ceremonies were properly carried out. He was constant and faithful in his own worship, and thus, by his example, gradually induced the whole Roman people to become attentive to their religion. The greatest of the gods that the Romans believed in was the god Jupiter. He was supposed to rule both the sky and the earth. He was so powerful that he could send thunderbolts from the heavens and make the earth tremble by his nod. He had a wife named Juno, who had a great deal to do with managing the affairs of the earth. It was at one time believed that Jupiter resided with many other gods on the top of a high mountain in Greece. This mountain was so thickly covered by clouds that the gods could not be seen. But they could see everything that took place on the earth. Jupiter had two brothers named Neptune and Pluto. Neptune was the god of the sea. He lived in a grand golden palace at the bottom of the Mediterranean. He ruled everything under and upon the waters of the world. Now and then he sailed over the ocean in a grand chariot drawn by large fish called dolphins. When he was angry, he caused the sea to rise in huge waves. Pluto, the other brother of Jupiter, was the god of Hades, or the land of the dead. His home was far down in the earth, where all was dark and gloomy. The Romans believed that when people died, they were borne away to the gloomy kingdom of Pluto. The other principal gods were Mars, Mercury, Vulcan, Apollo, and Janus. Mars was the god of war and was especially honored in Rome because it was believed that he was the father of Romulus. Certain days of the year were made festival days in his honor, and then there were splendid processions, songs of praise, and religious dances. Mercury, the son of Jupiter, was the god of eloquence and commerce. He was also the messenger of the gods. He was generally represented as flying swiftly through the air, carrying messages from place to place. On his head and feet were small wings, and in his hand he bore a golden staff with serpents twined around it. Vulcan was a skillful worker in metals. He had a great forge in the heart of a burning mountain, where he made wonderful things of iron, copper, and gold. He looked after the welfare of blacksmiths, coppersmiths, and goldsmiths, and was their special god. Apollo, also called Phoebus, which meant the sun, was the god of the day. He gave light and heat to the world. He was also the god of music, archery, and medicine. His sister, Diana, was the moon goddess, or goddess of the night. She was also the goddess of hunting. In pictures, she is sometimes represented with a quiver of arrows over her shoulder and holding a stag by the horns. The god Janus was very much honored by the Romans. It was believed that this god presided over the beginning of every undertaking, and so when the Romans began any important work or business, they prayed first to Janus. For this reason, the first month of the beginning of the year was called the month of Janus, or January. Janus was also the god of gates and doors. In statuary and pictures, he is often shown with two faces, looking in opposite directions, because every door faces two ways, outward and inward. Numa Pompilius built a temple in honor of Janus. The door of this temple was always open in time of war, as a sign that the god had gone out to help the Romans. In time of peace, the door was shut. The Romans also believed in Venus, the goddess of love, Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, Flora, the goddess of flowers, and many others. The Romans had no special day, such as our Sunday, for religious service, but their temples, except the temple of Janus, were open every day. They had prayers and songs, and sometimes what they called sacred dances. They also made offerings to the gods, such as fruits or vegetables, and oxen, lambs, or goats. The offerings went finally into the hands of the priests of the temples. Numa Pompilius reigned for nearly half a century, and under him the Romans were a peaceful, prosperous, and happy people. End of Chapter 2. Recording by Jason Mayoff, Montreal. jasonmayoff.voices.com. The Famous Men of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jason Mayoff. Famous Men of Rome by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Chapter 3. The Horatii and the Curatii. 1. The third king of Rome was Tullus Hostilius. In his reign, a remarkable combat took place between 3 Roman brothers and 3 Latin brothers. The combat came about in this way. For years, the people of Rome and the people of Alba, also called Latins, as has been already said, were continually quarreling. They would invade and plunder each other's lands. At last, after many petty contests, war was declared between the two nations. King Toolless marched the Roman army to the border of Alba, but here his progress was stopped by a great force of Latins under the command of Medius, the Alban king. Toolless looked at the strong lines of Latin soldiers standing firm and resolute to resist the advance of the Romans, and thought that it might be well to have a talk with Medius to see whether they could not agree on some way of settling the quarrel without a fight between the two armies. So he sent for Medius, and they talked the matter over. Medius also wished very much to avoid a battle, and he said to Tullus, "Would it not be well to fight in such a way that only a few of our soldiers would be killed instead of many? My plan is this. You shall select 3 of the best fighting men in the Roman army, and I will select the best 3 in the army of Alba. The 6 men shall fight in the presence of the 2 armies. If the Romans win, Alba will submit to Rome. But if the Latins win, then Rome must submit to Alba. What say you to the plan?" "It is a good one," said King Tullus, "and I agree to it. May the best men win." With these words they separated and went to prepare for the combat on which was to depend the fate of the two nations. 2. The Romans selected as their champions 3 brothers belonging to a family known as the Horatius family. The brothers were called the Horatii because this word is the plural form of Horatius. The Horatii brothers were tall, handsome men with wonderful strength, endurance, and courage. The Albans also selected 3 brothers as their champions. They were called the Curiatii. They were bold, skillful soldiers, famous for manly beauty and strength, and were champions well worthy to fight for a nation. When all was ready, the Horatii and the Curatii advanced to the center of a large field and took their places. They carried short, thick swords and large, round shields made of stout leather and metal. The 2 armies gathered around the 6 champions, but at a distance, so as to leave them plenty of room to fight. There was silence for a few moments, And then the shrill notes of a trumpet rang out as a signal for the battle. Clash, clang went the swords upon the shields, and the fight began. Quick, skillful blows were given for a short time, but no one was seriously hurt. Suddenly, the Latins shouted in intense excitement. Lo, one of the Horatii, after a fierce struggle with one of the Curatii, was stricken down dead. The Romans groaned, hung their heads, and looked in anxious doubt at their remaining two champions. Bravely the Horatii stood, 2 to 3, and fought with all their might. Step by step they drove the Curatii back across the field. Cheers rang out from the Romans at this heroic effort. The victory might yet be theirs. But alas, one of the Curatii, with a swift, sly sword thrust, killed another of the Horatii. Then the Latins shouted, "We have won! We have won! We have won! Hail to the brave Curatii!" The Romans were wild with grief and rage. They had now but one champion left, Horatius, the last of the heroic Horatii, and he was running from the field as if he had given up the fight. He was followed by the Curatii, though they were all wounded. One of them, running ahead of the others, came up to Horatius and was raising his sword when the Roman turned upon him quickly and slew him. The cries of the two armies were now hushed, as if by magic. All eyes were upon the champions, and there was painful silence. Another of the Curatii now came up and began to fight Horatius, but the Roman met the attack with great coolness and skill, and soon killed the second Latin. Thus, under the pretense of running away, Horatius separated the Curatii and slew 2 of them. Then he advanced in a furious manner on the other Latin and began a desperate fight with him. Soon he struck him down with a deadly blow. Rome was victorious. From the whole Roman army now came the cry, as if from one man, "Hail to the brave Horatius! Hail to the champion and savior of his country!" Then they seized Horatius in their arms and bore him in triumph to King Toolless, who placed on his head the laurel wreath of victory. This was one of the ways by which the Romans honored any of their soldiers who had been very brave in battle, but they also honored Horatius by erecting a statue of him in one of the temples of the city. 3. With songs of joy the army marched back to Rome. Horatius walked by the side of the king. A throng of women came forth from the gates of the city, eager to greet the soldiers and to rejoice with them over the great victory. The sister of Horatius was in the throng. She had been secretly engaged to be married to one of the Curatii, for the Romans and Albans were near neighbors and frequently visited one another in times of peace. When she learned that her brother had slain her lover, she began to weep bitterly. Then, pointing at Horatius, she cried out, "You have killed my lover! Do not come near me! I hate and curse you!" Horatius, in a fit of anger, suddenly drew his sword and stabbed her to the heart. As she fell dead at his feet, he cried in a loud voice, "So perish the Roman maiden who weeps for her country's enemy." For this shocking murder Horatius was tried and sentenced to death. But the people would not allow the sentence to be carried out. He was made to do a certain penance for the crime and afterwards was set free. End of chapter 3. Recording by Jason Mayoff, Montreal. jasonmayoff.voices.com.
Four of the famous men of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox, librivox.org. Recording by Paradise Camouflage. Famous Men of Rome by John H. Haaren and A.B. Poland. Chapter 4. The Tarquins. The next king of Rome was Ancus Martius. He was a grandson of Numa Pompilius, and a very good king. He thought that it would be an advantage to Rome to have a sea harbour for ships, so he founded a city at one of the mouths of the Tiber, on the coast of the Mediterranean, about 15 miles from Rome. The city was called Ostia, which is a Latin word meaning mouths. Latin was the language spoken by the Roman people. During the reign of Ancus Martius, a rich man named Lucumo came to live in Rome. He came from Tarquini, a town some miles distant from Rome, in a district or country called Etruria. So the Romans called him Tarquinius, which in English is Tarquin. A very wonderful thing happened to Tarquin when he was on his way to Rome. He drove in a chariot with his wife Tanaquil seated beside him, and their servants following behind. As they were approaching the city, an eagle which appeared in the sky above them came gently down and snatched the cap from Tarquin's head with its beak. After hovering around for a few moments, the eagle replaced the cap and with loud screams flew away. Tarquin was much surprised at this strange event. He didn't know what to think of it, but Tanaquil was much pleased. She said to her husband that it was a sign sent by the gods and meant that he was to be a great man, perhaps a king. Tarquin was not long in Rome before he became a favourite with everybody. The people liked him because he spent a great deal of money in doing good. The king also liked him and often asked his advice in affairs of government, for Tarquin was a man of great knowledge and wisdom. And when King Ancus became old and felt that his death was near, he appointed Tarquin the guardian of his 2 sons, who were then but boys. Soon afterwards Ancus died, and the people elected Tarquin king. He reigned for nearly 40 years and did a great deal for the good of the city. It was King Tarquin who began the building of the famous temple of Jupiter on the Saturnian hill, the same hill on which stood the fortress that Romulus built. While the workmen were digging for the foundations of the temple, they found a man's head so well preserved that it looked as if it had been buried quite recently. This was so strange a thing that the augurs were asked about it, and they said it was a sign that Rome would become the head or chief city of the world. So the new building was called the Capitol, from caput, the Latin word for head, and the hill was called the Capitoline Hill. This has given our language a word. We call the building in which our Congress meets, as well as that in which a state legislature meets, the Capitol. It took a long time to finish the Capitol, but when finished it was a great and beautiful building. It covered more than 8 acres. Its gates or doors were of solid brass, thickly plated with gold. The walls inside were all marble, ornamented with beautiful figures engraved in silver. Tarquin also began several other works in Rome, which were too great and costly to be finished in a lifetime. One of them was a wall round the city. The wall that Romulus made was only around Palatine Hill, but since then the city had been much enlarged. In course of time it covered 7 hills. That is why Rome is often called the 7-hilled city. The 7 hills were the Palatine, the Capitoline, the Caelian, the Quirinal, the Esquiline, the Viminal, and the Aventine. One of the other things Tarquin did was to establish a kind of police called lictors. These were officers who always walked before the king whenever he appeared in public. Each lictor bore upon his shoulder an axe enclosed in a bundle of rods tied with a red strap. This was called a fascis. It was a mark of the power of the king. The axe meant that the king might order criminals to be beheaded, and the rods meant that he might punish offenders by flogging. Another work of Tarquin was the circus, afterwards called the Circus Maximus, Great Circus. This was a place where horse races and games and shows of various kinds were held. The Romans were very fond of such amusements. Great numbers of them always went to the shows, but it was easy for them to go, for they did not have to pay for admission. The cost of the shows was paid often by rich Romans who wanted to gain the favour of the people, and often by the government. The circus had no roof, but there were a great many seats all around, and in the middle was a large open space for the performers. This space was covered in sand and was called the arena, a word which is Latin for sand. As so many people attended the circus, it had to be very large. In the time when Rome was an empire, about which you will read later on in this book, the Circus Maximus was so large that it contained seats for 250,000 people. From the circus and arena of the Romans, these words have come into use in our own language. Besides building a circus, King Tarquin also greatly improved the forum by making covered walks or porticos all around it. The forum was a large open space at the foot of the Capitoline Hill, where public meetings were held and where people came to hear the news or talk about politics. It was also used as a marketplace, and merchants showed their goods in shops or stores around the porticos. In course of time, great buildings were erected round the forum. These were courts of justice and temples and statues and monuments of various kinds. The Senate House, where the Senate held its meetings, was also in the forum. From the end of the forum, next the Capitoline Hill, there was a passage leading up to the Capitol. But the most useful thing King Tarquin did was the building of a great sewer through the city and into the Tiber. Before his time there was no sewers in Rome, though the places between the hills were swampy and wet. This made many parts of the city very unhealthy. Tarquin's sewer drained the swamps and carried the water into the river. It crossed the entire city. It was so high and wide that men could sail into it in boats, and it was so strongly built that it has lasted to the present time. The great sewer is still in use. Tarquin wanted very much to change one of the laws about the army, but an augur named Attius Navius told him such a thing could not be done without a sign from the gods. This made the king angry, and he thought he would try to show that the augurs had not the power or knowledge they were supposed to have. So he said to Attius, "Come now, I will give you a question. I am thinking whether a certain thing I have in my mind can be done or not. Go and find out from your signs if it can be done." Navius went away, and shortly afterwards returned and told the king that the thing could be done. Then Tarquin said, "Well, I was thinking whether or not you could cut this stone in two with this razor. As you say it can be done, do it." Navius took the razor and immediately cut the stone in two with the greatest ease. The king never again doubted the power of the augurs. On the death of Tarquin, his son-in-law Servius Tullius was made king. Tarquin had two young sons, and the sons of Ancus Martius were also living, but the people preferred to have Servius Tullius for their king. Servius was a very good king. He had many good laws made, and, like King Numa Pompilius, he divided some of the public lands among the poor people of the city. One of the important things Servius did was to finish the wall round the city which Tarquin had begun. This wall was very high. It was made of stone and earth, and on the outside there was a ditch 100 feet wide and 30 feet deep. There were several gates in the wall, but they were all well guarded night and day by soldiers, so that no enemy could enter. King Servius was the first to have a census taken in Rome. He made a rule or law that once every 5 years all the people should assemble in the Campus Martius to be counted. The word census is a Latin word meaning accounting or reckoning, and so we use it in our own country for the counting of the people, which takes place every 10 years. Servius Tullius was killed by King Tarquin's son, who was also called Tarquin but got the name of Superbus, or proud, because he was a very haughty and cruel man. The dead body of Servius was left lying on the street where he had been killed, and Tullia, wife of the wicked Tarquin and daughter of the murdered king, drove her chariot over it. Tarquin the Proud now became king. It was during his reign that the Sibylline books were brought to Rome. These books were not like our books. They were merely 3 bundles of loose pieces of parchment, having moral sentences on them written in the Greek language. This is the story of how the books were obtained. One morning, an old woman came to King Tarquin, carrying 9 books in her hands. She offered to sell them to the king, but when she named a large sum as the price, he laughed at her and ordered her away. The next day the woman came again, but only with 6 books. She had burned the other 3. She offered to sell the 6, but she asked the same price that she had asked the day before for the whole 9. The king again laughed at her and drove her away. The same day Tarquin went to visit the augurs in their temple, and he told them about the old woman and her books. The augurs declared that she was certainly a Sibyl, and that her books doubtless contained important predictions about Rome. The Sibyls were women who pretended to be able to foretell events. There were Sibyls in many countries, but the most famous of them was the Sibyl of Cumae, a town in the south of Italy. This was the Sibyl who brought the books to Tarquin. Tarquin was now sorry he had not taken the books, and he hoped the woman would come again. She did come on the following day, but she had only 3 books instead of 6. She had burnt the other 3 the day before. The king was very glad to see her, and he bought the remaining 3 books, but he had to pay just as much for them as the old woman had asked at first for the whole 9. Then the Sibyl disappeared and was never seen again. The ordinary books the Romans had were not like the Sibylline books. They had no printed books, for printing was not known for many centuries after. Their books were written with pens made of reeds. Their paper was made of the pith of a plant called a papyrus, and from this name the word paper is derived. To make a book, they cut the paper into leaves or pages, and after writing on them, they pasted the pages one to another sideways until all the pages of one book were put together. This long strip was made into a cylindrical roll and was called a volume, from the Latin word volumen, a roll. When the volume was being read, it was held in both hands, the reader unrolling it with one hand and rolling it with the other. The Sibylline books were put in the temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. 2 officers were appointed to keep watch over them. Whenever the Romans were going to war or had any serious trouble, they would consult the books. The way they did it was this. One of the officers would open the stone chest where the books were kept, and take out the first piece of parchment he laid his hands on. Then the Greek sentence found on the piece would be translated into Latin. It was sometimes very hard to tell what the sentence really meant. Often they had to guess. When they made sense out of it, they said that it was a prophecy of the Sibyl and would surely come to pass. End of chapter 4. Read by Andy from Inverarnon, melys.ws.
5 of the Famous Men of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philippa Jevons. Famous Men of Rome by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Chapter 5. Junius Brutus. 1. Tarquin the Proud had a nephew named Junius Brutus. He seemed to be a simpleton, but he was really a very wise man. His brother had been murdered by the king, and he feared the same fate himself, so he pretended to be half-witted, and went about saying and doing silly things. Tarquin, therefore, did him no harm, but rather pitied him. 2 sons of Tarquin once went to a noted fortune-teller, taking Brutus with them. The young men asked several questions. One was, "Who shall rule Rome after Tarquin?" The fortune-teller gave this answer: "Young men, whichever of you shall first kiss your mother shall be the next ruler of Rome." The king's sons at once started for home, each eager to be the first to kiss his mother. But Brutus thought that something else was really meant by the answer. So after they had left the fortune-teller, he managed to stumble and fall on his face. Then he kissed the ground, saying, "The earth is the true mother of us all." And, as we shall see, Brutus became the next ruler of Rome. The eldest son of Tarquin was named Sextus. He was a very bad man. He deeply injured a beautiful woman named Lucretia, the wife of Collatinus, his cousin. Lucretia told her husband and father and Junius Brutus of what Sextus had done, and called upon them to punish him for his wicked deed. Then she plunged a dagger into her breast and fell dead. Brutus drew the dagger from her bleeding body, and, holding it up before his horrified companions, exclaimed, "I vow before the gods to avenge the wronged Lucretia. Not one of the Tarquins shall ever again be king in Rome. Rome shall have no more kings." They all vowed with Brutus that Lucretia should be avenged, and that there should be no more kings in Rome. Then they took up her body and carried it to the Forum. There they showed it to the people, who gathered round in horror at the sight. Brutus no longer appeared dull and simple, but stood with head erect and flashing eyes, and spoke to the crowd in eloquent, stirring words. "See what has come from the evil deeds of the Tarquins," he shouted, pointing to the dead woman. "Let us free ourselves from the rule of these wicked men. Down with Tarquin the tyrant! No more kings in Rome!" The people were much excited by his speech, and they made the Forum ring with their cries. "Down with Tarquin! Down with Tarquin! No more kings! No more kings!" Then they resolved to take the power of king away from Tarquin, and to banish him and his family from Rome. They also decided to adopt the good laws which had been made years before by King Servius Tullius, and to choose 2 men each year to govern the nation, instead of a king. The men were to be called consuls, and were to rule in turn, one for 1 month, the other for the next, and so on for 12 months. At the end of the year, 2 new consuls were to be elected. Meanwhile, news of the revolt reached King Tarquin, who was at the time in camp with his army some distance from Rome. He instantly mounted his horse and rode in haste to the city. When he reached the gates, he found them shut against him. As he stood impatiently demanding to be admitted, a Roman officer appeared on the wall, and told him of the sentence of banishment. Tarquin rode away, and Rome was rid of him for ever. 510 B.C. 3. The people elected Junius Brutus and Lucius Collatinus, the husband of Lucretia, to be their first consuls. But after a short time Collatinus resigned, because he was himself a Tarquin. Publius Valerius was elected in his stead. Tarquin now sent messengers for his household goods and other things belonging to him which were in Rome. The messengers, while in the city, had secret meetings with a number of young men of noble families, and a plot was formed to restore Tarquin to the throne. The young nobles vowed that they would destroy the new republic and bring back the king, for they did not like government by the common people. But while they were making their plans, an intelligent slave overheard what they were saying. This slave went to Brutus and told him of the plot. All engaged in it were at once arrested and put in prison. 2 sons of Brutus himself, Titus and Tiberius, were found among the plotters. When Brutus learned that his own children were traitors, he was overcome with sorrow. For several days he shut himself up in his house and would see no one. But when the day for the trial came, he did his duty sternly as judge, the consuls being judges as well as rulers. Titus and Tiberius were proved guilty of treason, together with the others, and Brutus sentenced them to be whipped with rods and then beheaded. He even was a witness of the execution of the sentence, and we are told that he sat unmoved in his chair and did not turn away his eyes while his 2 sons were put to death. It was his duty to punish traitors, and he did his duty without sparing his own flesh and blood. After the loss of his sons, Brutus became dull and melancholy, and appeared to care very little for life. Tarquin made an attempt to take Rome with the aid of the people of 2 cities of Etruria, and Brutus led the Romans to the field to fight against their former king. During the first part of the battle, a son of Tarquin rode furiously at Brutus to kill him. Brutus saw him, and advanced rapidly on his horse to meet the attack. When they came together, each ran his spear through the body of the other, and both were killed. The death of Brutus maddened the Romans, and they fought fiercely until dark. Then the armies went to their camps, and no one knew which side had won. But in the middle of the night a loud voice came from a wood close by the camp of the Etruscans, as the people of Etruria were called. The voice said, "One man more has fallen on the side of the Etruscans than on the side of the Romans. The Romans will conquer in this war." The Etruscans believed that this was the voice of the god Jupiter, and they were so frightened that they broke up their camp and quickly marched back to their own land. End of chapter 5.
Of the famous men of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paradise Camouflage. Famous Men of Rome by John H. Haaren and A.B. Poland. Chapter 6. Horatius. For a long time, Rome was ruled by Publius Valerius. He was a good man. He caused laws to be passed for the benefit of the people, and was therefore called Publicola, which means the people's friend. He had to fight Tarquin frequently. The banished king was constantly trying to capture Rome and get back his throne. He got help from various nations and fought very hard, but was never successful in his efforts. At one time he was aided by Lars Porsena, king of Clusium, a city in Etruria, who gathered a large army and set out to attack Rome. But Porsena could not enter the city without crossing the Tiber, and there was only one bridge. This was called the Sublician Bridge. It was so called from the Latin word sublicoi, which means wooden beams. When the Romans saw the great army of Etruscans in the distance, they were much alarmed. They were not prepared to fight so powerful a force. The consul thought for a while, and then he resolved to cut down the bridge as the only means of saving Rome. So a number of men were at once set to work with axes and hammers. It was hard work, for the bridge was very strongly built. Before the beams supporting it were all cut away, the army of Porsena was seen approaching the river. What was to be done? It would take a few minutes more to finish the work, and if the farther end of the bridge could be held against the Etruscans for those few minutes, all would be well for Rome. But how was it to be held, and who would hold it? Suddenly, from the ranks of the Roman soldiers, the brave Horatius Cocles stepped out and cried to the council, "Give me 2 good men to help me, and I will hold the bridge and stop the enemy from coming over." Immediately, 2 brave men, Spurius Lartius and Titus Herminius, ran to his side. Then the 3 hurried over to the other end of the bridge and stood ready to keep off the enemy. When the army of Etruscans saw the 3 men standing to keep them back, a shout of laughter went up among them. 3 men to keep back thousands? How ridiculous! There the 3 brave Romans stood, however, at the entrance of the bridge, with determined faces and fearless eyes. Very quickly 3 Etruscans, stout, able fighters, came forth from the army to give battle to the 3 Romans. After a sharp combat, the Etruscans were killed. 3 more came out and continued the fight, but they too were beaten by Horatius and his companions. But now the bridge began to shake and crack. Horatius felt that it was about to fall, and he cried to Spurius and Titus to run back to the other side. While they did so, he stood alone and defied the whole Etruscan army, which was now rushing upon him. A whole army against 1 man. Javelins were hurled at him, but he skillfully warded them off with his shield. Just as the Etruscans reached him, the last beam was cut away, and the bridge fell with a tremendous crash. As it was falling, Horatius plunged into the Tiber, and praying to the gods for help, he swam to the other side in safety. The Romans received him with shouts of joy, and even the Etruscans could not help raising a cheer in admiration of his bravery. The 3 Romans were well rewarded. A fine statue of Horatius was built in one of the squares of the city. On the base of the statue was placed a brass tablet with an account of the heroic deed engraved on it. The Senate also gave Horatius as much land as he could plough around in a day. End of chapter 6 of Famous Men of Rome. Recording by Andy from Invernon, Scotland. The Famous Men of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paradise Camouflage. Famous Men of Rome by John H. Haaren and A.B. Poland. Chapter 7. Mucius the Left-Handed. But Porsenna still remained with his army on the other side of the river. He thought that by preventing food from being sent into the city, he could force the inhabitants to surrender. So he got ships and stationed them on the Tiber to drive away or seize any vessels that should attempt to come to Rome with food. Now there was in Rome at this time a very brave young man named Caius Mucius, and he thought of a plan to save the city. His plan was to march boldly into the enemy's camp and kill King Porsenna. So he concealed a sword under his tunic and went across the river to the Etruscan camp. Then he made his way to the place where the king was sitting. It happened that it was payday in the army, and the soldiers were getting their money. A secretary, who sat beside the king and was dressed very much like him, was talking to the men and giving them orders. Mucius mistook the secretary for Porsenna, and rushed forward and stabbed him to death. Instantly the daring Roman was seized by the guards. He heard the soldiers crying out that the secretary was killed. Then he knew what a mistake he had made. Porsenna was greatly enraged at seeing his secretary killed, and in a loud and angry voice he commanded Mucius to tell who he was and why he had committed such a deed. Without showing any sign of fear, the bold Mucius answered, "I am a Roman citizen. I came here to kill you, because you are an enemy of my country. I have failed, but there are others to come after me who will not fail. Your life will be constantly in danger, and you will be killed when you least expect it." On hearing these words, Porsenna jumped from his seat in a great fury, and threatened to burn Mucius to death if he did not at once tell all about the others who were coming to kill him. But Mucius was not frightened, and to show how little he cared about the king's threat, he thrust his right hand into the flame of a fire which had been lighted close by, and held it there without flinching. At the same time he cried out to the king, "Behold how little we Romans care for pain when it is to defend our country." Porsenna was astonished at this sight, and he so much admired the courage and patriotism of the Roman that he ordered the guards to set him free. Then Mucius said to the king, "In return for your kindness, I now tell you of my own free will what I would not tell you when you threatened me with punishment. Know then that 300 Roman youths have bound themselves by oath to kill you, each to make the attempt in his turn. The lot fell first on me. I have failed, but the attempt will be made again and again until someone succeeds." King Porsenna was so terrified on hearing this that he resolved to make peace at once with Rome. So he immediately sent messengers to the Senate. Terms of peace were quickly agreed upon. The Senate rewarded Mucius by giving him a tract of land on the banks of the Tiber. This land was afterwards called the Mucian Meadows. Mucius himself got the name of Scaevola, a Latin word which means left-handed. He had lost the use of his right hand by burning it in the fire. End of chapter 7. Recording by Andy from Haaren, Scotland.
Of the famous men of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philippa Jevons. Famous Men of Rome by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Chapter 8. Coriolanus. 1. One of the great men of Rome, not long after the banishment of the Tarquins, was Caius Marcius. He was a member of a noble family, and from his youth he had been noted for his bravery. In his time there was a war between the Romans and the Volscians, a people of a district in Latium. The Romans made an attack on Corioli, the capital city of the Volscians, but were defeated and driven back. Caius Marcius reproached the Roman soldiers for running from the enemy. His words made them ashamed, and they turned again to the fight. With Caius at their head, they sent the Volscians flying back into the city. Caius followed the enemy to the gates, which were partly open. When he saw this, he shouted to the Romans, "The gates are open for us, let us not be afraid to enter." Caius himself sprang in and kept the gates open for the Romans. After a short fight, the city was taken. Then everybody said that it was Caius who had taken Corioli, and that he should be called after the name of the city he had won. So ever afterward he was known as Coriolanus. 2. But though Coriolanus was a brave soldier and always ready to fight for Rome, he had some qualities that were not so good. He had great contempt for the common people, and he took part with those who tried to oppress them. Only a little while before the taking of Corioli, there was a serious trouble between the people and the patricians. A great many of the people earned their living by farming, but when there was a war, the strong men had to become soldiers, and as Rome was almost constantly at war, the men were nearly always away from their farms. Very often, therefore, they had to borrow money to support their families while they themselves were away fighting, for at this time Roman soldiers got no regular pay. Now it was the rich patricians who loaned the money, and if it was not paid back at the time agreed upon, they could put the people who owed it in jail, or they could sell their wives and children as slaves. In this way the plebeians often suffered much hardship. At last a great number of them resolved to leave Rome and make a settlement for themselves somewhere else in Italy. The patricians did not like this very much, for if the common people went away, there would be a scarcity of soldiers for the army. So the Senate, after thinking the matter over, proposed that the plebeians should elect officers of their own, to be called tribunes, who should have power to veto laws they did not like, that is, prevent them from being passed. The word veto, which is Latin for I forbid, is used in the same way in our own country. The President of the United States and the governors of some states have, within certain limits, power to prevent the passing of laws they do not approve. This is called the veto power. The plebeians were pleased with the proposal that they were to have tribunes, so they returned to Rome, and for a time there was peace between them and the patricians. But Coriolanus and other patricians were opposed to the election of tribunes, because they thought it gave the common people too much power. Once, when there was a famine in Rome and the poor were suffering greatly from want of food, the Greeks living in Sicily sent several ships laden with corn to Rome to relieve the people in distress. When the corn arrived, the Senate was about to order that it should be divided among the people who needed it, but Coriolanus interfered. "No, no," he said, "if the people want corn, let them first give up their tribunes. It must be either no corn or no tribunes." The people were so angry when they heard of this speech that they talked about killing Coriolanus, and they would have done so but for the wise advice of the tribunes. "No, no," said the tribunes, "you must not kill him, that would be against the law. But you can have him tried for treason against the people, and we will be his accusers." Coriolanus was then ordered to appear before the assembly of the people to be tried, for the people had power to try in their assemblies persons charged with such offences. But Coriolanus was afraid the assembly would condemn him, so he secretly fled from the city, leaving his family behind, and went to a town of the Volscians. The chief of the Volscians received Coriolanus in a friendly manner. Coriolanus then told him why he had left Rome. The Volscian chief was glad to hear it. He had long wanted to fight the Romans, but had been afraid to make the attempt. With the aid of such a soldier as Coriolanus, however, he was sure that Rome might be taken. So he raised a large army and put it under the command of the great Roman. 3. The Volscian army, led by Coriolanus, captured many cities belonging to the Roman Republic. At last Coriolanus resolved to attack Rome itself, and he marched his army towards the city. The Romans just then were not very well prepared for a battle, so the Senate decided to send messengers to Coriolanus to beg him to spare his native city and make terms of peace. The messengers chosen were 5 of the leading nobles, and they at once set out for the Volscian camp. Coriolanus received them cordially, for they were old friends, but he said that he would not spare Rome unless the Romans would give up all the lands and cities which they had taken from the Volscians in former wars. To this the Senate would not agree, and Coriolanus refused to listen to any other terms. The Romans then began to prepare for battle, though they feared very much that they would be defeated. But while the men were thus in fear and doubt, the women of Rome saved the city. Valeria, a noble Roman lady, remembered that Coriolanus had always dearly loved his mother. Perhaps, thought she, he may listen to her, though he will hear no one else. So Valeria, with a large number of noble ladies, went to the house of Veturia, the mother of Coriolanus, and said to her, "The gods have put it into our hearts to come and ask you to join with us to save our country from ruin. Come then with us to the camp of your son, and pray him to show mercy." The aged mother at once agreed to go, so she got ready immediately, and set out for the camp of the Volscians, accompanied by a great number of ladies, and her son's wife and little children. It was a strange sight, this long line of Roman ladies, all dressed in mourning, and even the Volscian soldiers showed them respect as they passed along. Coriolanus happened to be sitting in front of his tent in the Volscian camp, with a number of officers around him, as the procession came in view. "Who are these women?" he asked. Before an answer could be given, he saw that among them were his mother and wife and children, and he stood up and hastened forward to meet them. They fell on their knees and begged him to spare his native city. Coriolanus seemed deeply distressed. He made no answer, but bent his head, pressed his hand to his breast, and gazed down upon the dear ones who knelt at his feet. Then his mother said, "If I had no son, Rome would not be in this danger. I am too old to bear much longer your shame and my own misery. Look to your wife and children. If you continue in your present course, you will send them to an early death." Coriolanus was so grieved that for some minutes he could not speak. At last he cried out, "Oh, mother, what have you done to me? You have saved Rome, but you have ruined your son." Then he embraced his mother, and looked at her sadly for a moment. He also embraced and kissed his wife and children, and told them to go back to Rome, for they would be safe there. The women then returned to the city, and Coriolanus marched away with the Volscian army. Rome was saved. Coriolanus lived the rest of his life with the Volscians, but he never again made war against his native city. It is supposed that he died about the middle of the 5th century before Christ. End of chapter 8.
Chapter 9 of The Famous Men of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Alec Datesman. Famous Men of Rome by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Chapter 9. The Fabii. At about the time in which Coriolanus lived, the family of the Fabii were very powerful in Rome. Among the leaders or chief men of the family at that period were Quintus Fabius, Marcus Fabius, and Caeso Fabius. In those times, the Roman nobles were very rich and powerful. They held all the high offices of government and cared very little about the welfare of the plebeians. Often they treated them very harshly. The Fabii also treated the plebeians harshly. Once, when Quintus Fabius defeated the Volscians in a battle, he sold all the valuable things he took from the enemy and put the money into the public treasury. Such things were called spoils. The Roman generals usually divided the spoils among the soldiers. This was the way the soldiers were paid in those days. But Quintus Fabius would not divide the spoils, so the soldiers were very bitter against him. But sometime afterwards, Marcus Fabius was elected consul, and once after a great battle with the Vientians, a people of Etruria, he took the entire care of the poor wounded soldiers and supplied all their wants at his own expense. The next year his brother Caeso Fabius was consul, and he tried to get the Senate to divide among the poor citizens the lands that had been taken from the Vientians, and other people whom the Romans had defeated in war. Often afterwards in the Senate, the voice of a Fabius was heard speaking for justice to the plebeians. The common people, therefore, soon loved the whole family of the Fabii instead of hating them as they had before. The nobles were very angry because the Fabii took the side of the plebeians, and they threatened to do all they could against them. Now the Fabii saw clearly that it would be useless to attempt to fight the nobles, because the nobles had a great deal of power and could do almost whatever they pleased in Rome. Therefore the Fabii thought that it would be better for them to remove from the city and make a new home for themselves somewhere else. So they resolved to do this, and the place they selected was on the banks of the river Cremera, a few miles from Rome. At this time the Romans were again at war with the Vientians. These people lived in Veii, a city on the Cremera River. One day, when there was a discussion in the Roman Senate about this war, Caeso Fabius said, "As you know, we of the house of the Fabii are going to leave Rome and settle on the borders of the country of the Vientians. If you give us permission, we will fight those people and try to defeat them for the honor of Rome and the glory of our house. We will ask neither money nor men from the Senate. We will carry on the war with our own men and at our own cost." The senators were glad of the chance to get rid of the Fabii, and so they at once gave them the permission they asked for. The Fabii then began to make preparations for their departure. There were over 300 men in addition to womenfolk, children, and servants, and when all were ready, they marched out of the city to their new home with Caeso Fabius at their head. At first, the Fabii had only a camp on the Cremera River, but afterwards they built a small city with a strong fortress. Many good Roman soldiers came and joined them,
and soon they had a fine army of earnest, devoted men. The Vientians were soon conquered. Fabius and his brave men defeated them in several battles, and at last the Vientians made up their minds that they had got enough of war. Then they returned to their own city of Veii, and remained quiet for a long time. But they declared that they would destroy the Fabii whenever they could get the chance. Now it was an old custom of the Fabii to have a special worship of the gods on a certain day of every year. Early in the morning of that day, all the men of the family would go in a body to a famous temple on a hill near Rome, and have religious services for several hours. The men took no arms with them, as it was thought improper to go armed to religious worship. The Vientians heard of this annual religious service of the Fabii, and saw in it a chance for revenge. So they resolved to kill the Fabii the next time they went to the temple for their special service. When the day came, the Fabii set out as usual. On their way to the temple, they had to go over a road which had high, steep rocks on each side. There a large number of Vientian soldiers hid themselves, and when the unsuspecting Fabii came along, a furious attack was made on them from front and rear. Without arms they could not fight very well. They made the best defense they could, but it was useless. They were all killed except one young man who escaped to Rome. Thus the cowardly Vientians had their revenge. End of Chapter 9. Recorded by Alec Datesman, Brooklyn, New York. Chapter 10. Of the Famous Men of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Famous Men of Rome by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Chapter 10. Cincinnatus. 1. In the mountains east of Latium there lived a rather wild people, called Equians, who were very often at war with Rome. After some time of peace and good conduct, these people suddenly began to plunder the rich farms of the Romans. This was about 450 years before the birth of Christ, and not long after the Vientians had destroyed the Fabian family. As soon as the Roman Senate heard what the Equians were doing, it sent messengers to the Equian king to complain of the wrong. The messengers found the king in his camp, sitting near a huge oak tree, but when they spoke to him, he answered them rudely, saying, "I am too busy now with other matters. Go tell your message to the oak yonder." This made the messengers very angry, and one of them said, "We shall tell it to the oak, but we shall tell it also to the gods, and call them to witness how you have broken the peace. And they shall be on our side when we come to punish you and your people for the crimes you have committed against us." And it is said that the angry messengers did tell the message to the oak, and to all the other trees around, and boldly shouted that war would come from this insult to Rome. Then the messengers returned to Rome, and told the Senate how they had been insulted by the Equian king. The Senate at once declared war against the Equians, and ordered the consul Minucius to lead an army against them. The Romans easily won a few battles at first. Then the Equians began to retreat, as if they did not mean to fight any more. The Romans followed swiftly, until they were drawn into a narrow valley on each side of which were high rocky hills. It was a trap, and the Romans knew it before they had marched very far from the entrance. The Equian king then closed up the valley with strong barricades, and placed his troops at the entrance and along the hills, so that the Romans could not get out. In the valley there was very little grass for the horses, and no food for the men, so that if the Romans were not soon relieved, both they and their horses would die of hunger. 2. But luckily for the Romans, a few of their horsemen had managed to get out of the valley before the Equians closed it. These horsemen rode as fast as they could to Rome, and told the Senate how Minucius and his soldiers were placed. What was to be done? No one seemed to know at first, but after a good deal of discussion, a senator said, "Let us make Lucius Quinctius dictator. He is the only man who can save us." The Senate agreed to this, and so Lucius Quinctius was chosen dictator. A dictator had more power than the Senate or the consuls. All his commands had to be obeyed, as if he were a king. But there was not a dictator always. A dictator was appointed only when there was some great danger, and he held office only for 6 months. Lucius Quinctius belonged to a noble family. He was a great soldier, and had won many battles for his country. He had such beautiful, long, curly hair that the people called him Cincinnatus, which means curly-haired, and this is the name by which he is known in history. At the time Cincinnatus was appointed dictator, he lived on a small farm outside of Rome. He worked on the farm himself, and when the messages from the Senate came to tell him that he had been chosen dictator, they found him plowing in one of his fields. He left his plow where it stood and hastened to Rome, where he was welcomed by all the people. The first thing he did was to raise a new army. He gave orders that every man of suitable age should buckle on his sword and be ready in a few hours to march to the help of Minucius and his soldiers. Before evening, Cincinnatus and his army marched out of the city for the Alban Hills, where the Romans were shut up. They reached the palace in the early morning and formed in a line all around the hills. The Equians then found themselves hemmed in on every side between two Roman armies, the army of Minucius and the army of Cincinnatus. They fought as well as they could, but they were quickly overpowered, so that they could do nothing but cry to the Roman commander to spare their lives. Cincinnatus spared their lives, but he made them pass under the yoke. The yoke was formed of 2 spears, fixed upright in the ground, and a third fastened across near the top from one to the other. Cincinnatus made the Equians lay down their arms and pass out, every man of them, under the yoke of spears. They had to bend their heads as they did so, for the spears were not very long, and the one on top was only a few feet from the ground. The yoke was set up between 2 lines of Roman soldiers, and as the Equians passed under it, the Romans jeered at them and taunted them. Having to pass under the yoke was regarded as the greatest disgrace that could happen to soldiers. Many much preferred to suffer death. The practice has given to our language the word subjugate, meaning to subdue or conquer, from the Latin words sub, under, and jugum, yoke. When the soldiers of Consul Minucius came out of the valley, they shouted for joy and crowded around Cincinnatus, thanking him as their deliverer and protector. "Let us give Cincinnatus a golden crown," they cried. But the great general only smiled, shook his head, and gave the order for the homeward march. Great was the rejoicing in Rome when the news of the victory was received. The Senate ordered that there should be a general holiday and a grand parade through the city. And so the victorious army marched into Rome amid the shouts and cheers of the people. Cincinnatus rode in a splendid chariot drawn by 6 handsome black horses. He wore the dress of dictator of Rome, and on his head was a laurel wreath. Behind his chariot the Equian king and his chiefs walked, looking very humble and forlorn. Following them were slaves laden with the arms and other valuable things taken from the enemy's camp. With bugles and trumpets gaily sounding, the parade went through the city. The chariot of Cincinnatus was followed by a throng of people cheering and crying, "Hail to the dictator! Hail to the conqueror!" Flowers were showered upon him and thrown before his chariot wheels. A few days afterward, Cincinnatus gave up the office of dictator and went back to his little farm. End of Chapter 10. Recorded by Alec Datesman, Brooklyn, New York.